Next, let's talk about floating or float positioning. So this is going to be your go-to solution for creating column structure in your page layouts. You can see in this example here, this person has a header and a footer at the top and bottom of the page, and they'd like to create a sidebar that's positioned to the left of some main content that's positioned to the right here. So by using floating, we can tell one element to float to the left and this other element here to float to the right. And that's going to allow us to have block level elements that can appear side by side. So if we set the sidebar, say that this one here is a div that has an ID of sidebar, and maybe this is a div that has an ID of main, we can then set #sidebar to float : left, and we can set main to float : right. So the float property allows us to specify either left or right. So whenever you float elements, we have to be aware that there's some goofy things that are going to happen. So initially, when you first start learning float positioning, it can actually be quite frustrating, but as long as I clearly explain to you all of the issues that you may run into when you're using float positioning, then hopefully you won't be as frustrated and you'll have a clear understanding about why certain elements are misbehaving. So in this example, they actually floated the main content to the left and they decided to float the sidebar to the right. And they had a footer that was underneath down here. But what happened? It's kind of strange. The footer was supposed to stay at the bottom. Remember, up here we have the footer at the bottom. But for some reason, when I float things, elements that are below things that are floating tend to try and pull up beside them. Now sometimes this is desirable. So sometimes we want to wrap text around images in a page and things like that. And floating is great because whenever you float something, elements that are below the element that are floating are affected by that, and they will tend to pull up next to it if they can fit there. So in this case, the footer has some space to fit below the sidebar, and since these things are all floating, it's going to try and pull up beside or next to the things that are floating. And that's simply because the footer was physically in the code below the things that are floating, so it's pulling up next to it. Now if we want to prevent this, we can actually stop this from happening. Sometimes we actually want this to happen, it's a good thing, and other times we're upset because this element shouldn't be up here. We want the footer to go back down here. So if we want to tell the footer not to move up next to the floats, we can use a property in CSS called clear. We can say clear both. So by saying footer clear both, we're able to get that footer to clear past the height of those elements. So clear accepts 3 different values. You can say clear left, and that will clear past the height of anything floating left, and only past the height of things floating left. And you can also say clear right, which will clear past the height of anything floating to the right. Or to cover all your bases, you can say clear both, and it will clear past the height of both things that are floating left or right. Okay, and again, then that allows the footer to clear past the main content and the sidebar. Okay. So as if that isn't really enough sort of goofy occurrences that floating causes, floating has a few other things that it does that is a little bit strange. But again, as long as we understand why it's doing it and how to fix it, it won't be frustrating for us. So another issue that you sometimes get when you're floating an element is you get something called a collapsed parent. So imagine that this gray box here is a parent, meaning that it's a container and we place these boxes inside of it. Okay, so here I have text inside that says I'm a static parent, right? And I floated these 3 boxes to the left and this box to the right. One thing we'll point out here is that when you float something to the left, if there's other elements that can fit there that are also floating to the left, they're just going to stack up side by side like this. So sometimes you can create multi-column structure simply by floating everything in one direction, which is kind of a cool trick to do that. Okay, so it turns out though, this is just something to be aware of. You have to just always keep in mind when you're floating something, is that whenever you float all of the children inside of a parent, it's as if the parent no longer has a reference for how tall to be. The metaphor I use for this is, imagine that, normally elements, when they're inside the parent, it's like when they're in high school and they haven't graduated yet, they haven't gone off to college, and the parents keep their room for them. Like if you haven't gone off to school yet, you're a static element. You're not positioning at all. You're not floating yet. So when you're in high school, you're not floating, and your parents keep your room for you. They're like, oh, this is your room. It's your space. You live here. And for that reason, the parent has a reference for how large to be, right? It can surround the child, okay? Now, when you float an element, it's kind of like sending it off to college. It's like it floats away. So it's kind of like it left home. And even though it appears to be inside of this parent element, it's actually floating. So these guys are floating left, this one's floating right. And since all of the children they floated off to college, the parent isn't keeping their room for them anymore. Like basically the parent no longer has a reference for how tall to be, so it collapses. Or maybe you could say the parent collapses because they get sad because all of its children floated away. So we can actually fix this by using something called ClearFix, which is sort of a CSS hack or a solution that developers have come up with along the years to fix this issue. So you can actually stop a parent from collapsing even if its children are floating like this and get this effect by using something called the ClearFix solution. Now this looks like a lot of CSS, but I'm going to break this down for you. Basically what's happening here is you're creating a class, and you can name this class anything you want. Typically this is called ClearFix, and in fact if you open up your browser and you Google ClearFix, it will come up with tons of sites where you can copy and paste this code so you don't have to memorize it, and also a lot of discussion on it and why we use it. I'll actually provide a link below the video that will link to a tutorial giving the code and also discussing ClearFix. So first thing we do is we create a class, and I chose to name this ClearFix, which is a common name people call this. And then we're using a special pseudo class selector called after. We're saying :after. Okay, so what after does is whatever element that you apply this class to, it's going to go inside that element, and after all of its children, it's going to apply this style that you put here. I'm going to say that one more time. So by applying the pseudo class selector here, :after, that's going to allow it to function so that whatever element we apply this class of ClearFix to, it's going to go inside of that element, and after, :after all of its children in that element, and in our case, after all of the floating children, it's going to apply this style. So what we're doing is we're adding a property here called content, and in quotes we're going to put some text. You can actually literally type the word hello here, and you will see the word hello will appear after all of the floating elements. So content is a way you can actually use CSS to insert text content into an element. Okay, and this is actually the only time I use this property, because I like to reserve CSS for styling, and I like to reserve HTML for actually creating text and physical content. Okay, that's abiding by a theory called the separation of concerns, where we want to separate HTML as being content and CSS as being style. This is one small exception to the rule where I'll actually add a period symbol after all of the content. I know this sounds crazy, but stick with me here, hang in there, and this will all slowly come together and make sense why we're doing this. So basically we create a class called ClearFix, we say :after, and we're going to apply it to the parent that's collapsing. So what's going to happen is whatever parent, the collapsing parent that needs to clear past the floating children, we apply this class to it, and inside of this element, this collapsing parent, it's going to go after all of the floating elements because we use the :after, and it's going to add a period symbol. Actually, physically, a little dot will appear. The period symbol, or the text character of the period, will appear below all those floating children. The next thing we do is we tell that content to display block. Now remember, block level elements, they are king of the horizontal space. They take up all of that horizontal space down there. And since we don't have a width specified for the content, it's just going to take up 100% of the space inside of that parent container. So now our little period symbol is a block level item in the page and takes up all the horizontal space. And then we use our friend clear both. Remember, we used clear both before on the footer. What does clear do? Well, clear, you'll remember, is what we use to tell any element, in this case, this little period symbol content, to clear past the height of anything floating. So this moves that period symbol to clear past the height of the floating children. Okay? And then we basically have a reference for how tall the parent should be. The parent container now knows how tall to be because this period symbol has been pushed down below all the floating children. It's kind of like if you imagine, if we use the metaphor of the floating elements are kind of like the children floated off to college. This ClearFix solution is kind of like having a foreign exchange student come and stay with the parents so that they know basically to take over your room so that the house doesn't close up, right? Or in other words, so the parents aren't sad, they don't collapse their height. It gives the parents a reference for how tall to be because there's an exchange student hanging out in there, in this case a period. But we don't want to see this exchange student because that's going to make our, well, that sounds mean, but it's going to make our layout look messy because we'll have a little period symbol visible underneath our floating elements. So what we do is we set the visibility to hidden. So this is kind of like the exchange student that's always studying and you never really see them. So we make the period symbol hidden by saying visibility hidden, and we make sure it doesn't take up any height by saying height 0 and line height, which is the height of the text, the height between lines of text, to 0. And this will make it so that in all browsers, this little content will be invisible. So this content gives the parent a reference for how tall to be so it doesn't collapse, but we also make it invisible so it's hidden. So this is kind of a, it seems like a pretty crazy sort of bit of code here, but actually this works quite well and it'll work in all browsers. Okay, let's actually take a look at that inside of an example. So it's one thing for me to talk about these things, but what if we have a real example here to look at? So let's go to, this is tinker.io, and you can use this link CB346 to see the completed version of this example if you'd like to take a look at it later. You can see here I've just created some divs. These are just some boxes that we're going to use for our layout. And this first one, it just has the word above written in it, and I gave it a class of above. Again, I'm just giving these kind of generic class names. And we also have one at the bottom here with a class of below, and that also has the word below written in it. And then here we have a container. This is our parent container, which I gave a class name of container. And nested inside of this parent is 3 boxes, which I gave a class of box and just named them here 1, 2, 3. Okay. Let's take a look at the CSS code we wrote for these guys then. So the box at the top that has a class of above, we gave this guy a background color of lime. And we also gave it 10 pixels of spacing inside and a margin, which is 10 pixels of spacing outside. Okay. We also gave a background color to container, so we can see all these elements. They all have a background color. This also has padding and margin. We also have a box down here which has a background color of aqua, and same as the boxes in the previous example, we just gave them a width and height of 100 pixels and some padding and margin as well. And then we also have this class at the bottom here called dot below. So below has a background color of yellow and has some padding and margin. Okay. So if we come over here, we can see here's our box above, here's our container parent, and here is below. Now by default, all of these divs are displaying block, so they're taking up 100% width of the screen, and they don't have any special positioning. None of them have been told to float yet. So because these are divs, they're displaying one on top of the other. They're king of the horizontal space here. So 1, 2, and 3 are stacked vertically. Now let's say hypothetically that I would like to make these guys position into a column structure. Let's say we want to make 3 columns, 1, 2, 3, side by side. So we can go down here into this class of box, and I'll come down here, and I'm going to use the property here called float. So we'll set these to float position, and we'll say float left. So they're going to go as far to the left as they can inside of this parent, and if there's space, they're going to stack up side by side as long as there's available space for them to all fit. It looks like there's plenty of space here, so it should work. So we have these guys to float left, and I'm going to click run. And there we can see these guys are now displaying side by side. 1, 2, 3 are now floating. So we're seeing a few goofy things happening here, and this frustrates a lot of people when they're dealing with positioning. I want to point out a few things. Okay, so first of all, the div called above is completely unaffected by the fact that these are floating. I'm going to say that again. The element above the floating elements, this one, the div with the class of above here, this guy is completely unaffected by floating. So whenever you float something, it only affects elements below that element that's floating. Only elements that are physically written below here, like this bottom div here, the footer that has the word below written in it, is affected. Okay, so because these guys are floating, this guy down here below, it can fit, so it's trying to float up next to these guys. Okay, so how do I fix that? If I ever have an element that I do not want to float up next to my other elements here, if I don't want it to pull up next to these floating elements, I can tell it to clear past the height of those floating elements. So to do that, I'm going to go into the class of below here, and we're going to go ahead and say clear, colon, and I'll just say both, which will clear past anything floating left or right. In this case, I could get away with just clear left, but to be on the safe side, cover all my bases, we'll just say clear both, like that. So I set this div of below to clear both. Now if I refresh that, you can see now below is behaving and it's slipping below those floating elements. So that's one thing that may kind of stress you out when you're using float positioning. You just have to be aware of the fact that when you float things, elements below them may pull up next to it. And you may want this to happen, or you may not want this to happen. If you do not want it to happen, you can set it to clear both, just like that. Okay, other things that are happening that might kind of frustrate you is you may see the parent element disappear. Because I gave this parent container some padding, it's keeping at least some padding inside of it, so I see it as a gray bar. But if you remove this padding, you may even see stuff disappear like this. Watch this here. If I set this to 0 padding in that parent container, you can't actually see it at all. You might say to yourself, what the heck, what happened to that parent container? I don't see its background color anymore. Occasionally you're going to want to surround your columns, maybe if you want another color behind them or another image behind them. In the case of the exercise, we're going to add like a wood texture behind our column structure. So we're going to need like a parent container there. And if you don't want that parent to collapse, this gray parent here to collapse, we need to use the clear fix to get this to work. Okay, so let's go ahead and add that clear fix in here. So again, the floating elements are kind of like children that have gone off to college, and the parent's sad, too sad that it collapses. It doesn't have a reference for how tall to be anymore. Okay, so what we do is let's go into the CSS and let's write that clear fix. So we're going to say dot clear fix, and again, that's just a common name to name it. You can actually name it whatever you like. And we're going to say colon after, which is going to specifically go into the element we apply this to and add this styling after all of the other elements, all the other children elements inside of it. And we're going to say content. So I'll say content, and I'm just going to make a period symbol because it's small and unassuming. And we're going to tell that content to display block, so it takes up all the horizontal space there. And then we're going to basically tell this guy to clear, just like we did with the box below. We want this, now we want this little period symbol that's going to appear, you know, like below or next to all these, you know, it's going to colon after means it's going to appear after all these floating children. And we're going to set it to display block so it takes up all the horizontal space. And then we're going to say clear both to clear past the height. And now the parent should have a reference for how tall to be, but we don't want to see that little period symbol. That's not going to be very attractive, so we're going to set visibility to hidden, and we're also going to set its height to 0 so the little period symbol doesn't take up any height, and we also want to say line height and set the line height of the text to 0, like that. Okay, so that's the first step, is to create a class that we can apply, and we can apply this now to any element, any parent element that's collapsing. Okay, so we're going to go up here to the parent that has the issue. So this guy called class container that has the gray background color, this is the one that has the problem. So we're going to go inside this class equals container, and we're going to put a space, and we're going to apply another class here called clearfix, like that. Notice I didn't have to write the colon after part here. I only have to use the name of the class, which is clearfix. Okay, and then if we come back here and we refresh the code, you can see it fixes it. So now the parent knows how tall to be, even though the children are floating inside of it. Okay, so we've learned most of the things that can kind of get you into trouble when you're using float positioning, such as elements that try and jump up next to the floating elements and you have to set them to clear both to pull down below. And we also looked at parents. When all the children are floating inside of a parent, they have the tendency to collapse, and we looked at using clearfix to correct that issue. Let's actually go back to what we were discussing earlier regarding the two different box models and sometimes the issues you might run into when you have to face setting up the widths of your columns to fit both box models. So for this example, let's go ahead and change a few things around here. I'm going to go to the box class here, and let's actually remove the padding inside of it. So we'll say padding 0, and let's actually set the margin to 0 also for now. Okay, and then let's go ahead and change the width to be a percentage. So let's see, so if I have 3 columns here and I want these guys to take up 100% of the space here, we could set the width of each one to 33.3%, would make each of the 3 take up, well, I guess that would get us up to 99.9%. Maybe we can do like 0.333 to get it even closer. And then we'll go ahead and run that. And we can see those 3 elements are equally spaced. So here's 1, 2, and 3. So each of those columns is side by side. So this is working when we have no padding and no border. So actually I'm in Chrome right now. I'm in Chrome browser, which uses the W3C box model, where when you specify a width, it does not include padding or border. Okay, so this works out just fine because there's no padding or border. But let's see what happens now when we decide to when we decide to actually give this some padding and some border. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give the container a fixed width. So for example, since these are all scaling 33%, I can actually give a fixed width to the container now. So we'll say hypothetically that we wanted the parent container to be 800 pixels wide, something like that. So this should scrunch everything in here. Okay, and now this container has a fixed width, and we're going to say, well, we want to add some padding or some border around these columns. Okay, so I already know that this is going to break in this particular browser because of its box model that it uses. So 33.3 for each of these should add up to 100%, but that's not counting the padding or the margin. So let's say we set the padding inside to, well, I could use pixels, like 20 pixels, but why not use a percent, and then we can actually do the math to see like how much extra percent we're adding. So let's say that I add like 1% padding around all sides of the element. And I'm going to go ahead and click run. And that broke it. So the reason why is that the width of each column is 33%. So 33 plus 33 plus 33 adds up to like 99.999, basically 100%, right? But then when we have padding, that's 1% padding on each side, so that adds an additional 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6% of padding. So this thing's now 106. It's actually should be taking up 106%, which doesn't fit within the 100% wide width of the 800 pixel container. So because of that, there's not enough room for each element to exist. To make this a little bit easier to see, why don't we go ahead and add a border here onto this. We'll say border 1 pixel solid black, like that. Okay, now it's a little bit easier to see where each of the divisions are. Okay, so what if I did want to add border and padding onto these elements, but I did not want to have that added on in addition to the width? I wanted it to be included in this 33% width. So what we can do is we can actually set Chrome or any other browser to force it to use the Internet Explorer box model that includes border and padding into the width. So let me go ahead and come down here and we'll just zoom in. And I'm going to go ahead and type the star key, Shift and 8, to create a star. This is called the universal selector. And the universal selector is how you can select all elements, literally every single element. And we'll tell all elements to have box dash sizing, and to make it the IE box method we can say border dash box, and we can add the prefixes dash moz dash box dash sizing, and also set that to border box. And we can also add the prefixes for WebKit dash box dash sizing, just to cover all our bases so it's going to work in any browser. And we'll say border dash box, like that. So this tells all elements to adopt, regardless of the browser, it's telling all elements in the page to adopt the Internet Explorer box model that does include padding and border into width. So it shouldn't be extra width, right? And then we'll go ahead and click run, and you can see it fixes that issue. The cool thing about this is that I can change the padding now and it shouldn't break. I can make this padding now 3%, like that, and that'll give me more spacing inside the box. You can see it move the text down further. We can also add a thicker border if we want. We could say like, oh, the border now should be 2 pixels instead, or something like that. And I can run that there. And the nice thing about using percents for these columns is that now if I change the size of the container, they'll respond accordingly. So if I change my mind and I want this container to be 600 pixels wide, then they'll shrink like that. They'll all respond accordingly. And I can also make it larger, like 900 pixels or something like that, and they'll respond like that. So I guess 900's off my screen a little there, but at any rate, you can see that I can change the size of the container. I can even set the container to a percentage if I want. I could say like 90% and refresh that. And then we just have the 10% left over here. So that's pretty cool. Okay. Let's see, what else would we like to talk about? So margin. Margin is not included in either of the measurements of box model. So that's one thing I have to be aware of. If I add a margin here of just even 1%, watch what happens. This will actually break it, and not even the box sizing property can save us, because neither the W3C box model nor the IE box model includes margin, which is the spacing outside of elements. So I just added 1% margin, which will be 1% on the left and right of 1, the left and right of 2, and the left and right of 3. So that's a total of 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6% that it's going to add on an additional. So this is going to be 6% over what it needs to be to stay side by side floating. So if I refresh, it's going to jump the third box down. It's going to break it there like that. Okay. So my options here are to be aware of the fact that I'm subtracting that percentage, right? So if I have 100% of space here, right? 100. We have to think of the parent container as the availability of 100% of space inside of the parent container there. And what I can do is I can subtract that 1% off each side. So what we can do is we can grab the calculator app and bring that up here, and we can do some math. So if I have 100% of available space and I subtract the 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6% of margin, that gives me 94% left over, and that has to be divided amongst these three, the width of these three boxes. So I can take that 94 and I can divide by 3, and that gives me 31.3 repeating. So it's pretty simple math. All I have to do here is come back in and change the width of the box from 33 to 31% to make up for the margin. And that fixes it, and I still have spacing in between the boxes like that. So that's pretty cool. And I still can come back to this container here and change the width any way I like, and it's going to fix it basically. Can even just remove it there like that and make it the exact width. Okay. So we've discussed pretty much most anything you'd need to do in a layout, but there is one thing we've left out, and that's how to center things in the layout. What we can do is, a typical strategy is to create something called a wrapper. So I can go into this code here, and I'm just going to indent all this code. Whoops, there we go. And we're going to surround this code with an outer container, and I'm going to give this guy an ID of wrapper, like that, and we'll close it down here. We'll just say /div. And I can even write a comment if I like to myself to say that this is the ending of the wrapper, like that. So you can see we surrounded all the content here with a opening wrapper and a closing wrapper. This basically puts all the other boxes inside of a larger box. And now I have the ability to style that larger box and control where it's positioned. So I'll just go ahead and come into the CSS and create, since this is an ID, if I want to create a selector for it, I have to use the hashtag, and the name of the particular ID is wrapper. So I can say hashtag wrapper like that. And now I can style this. So let's give this a width. Let's set everything to 800 pixels again, like that. And since I don't have a width specified for my other containers, like above container and below, they're just going to be as wide as they can be because they're block level elements. And since the wrapper is going to have a specific width, they're just going to be as wide as they can until they run into the edge of that wrapper. So let's take a look at that. So my wrapper has a width of 800 pixels, and then I can click run, and that will keep everything constrained within that 800 pixels there. So that's pretty cool. What if I'd like to now center all of these things within the page layout? So remember that we can use margin as spacing on the outside of elements. Okay? So margin also accepts a value of auto, and auto margin basically will just create an automatic amount of margin where it will just push margin out from the element until it runs into something else like a parent container or the edge of the browser window. So since I have a width set, I can now set this margin to auto margin so that it will create an equal amount of margin on both sides. So basically I want to set the left margin to auto and the right margin to auto. And if I want any margin on the top and bottom, I could set that as well. In this case, I think what I'll do is I'll create 0 margin on the top and bottom by putting a 0 there, and then I will put auto for the left and right. So remember, when you use two values inside of either padding or margin, two values indicates that the first value represents the top and bottom spacing, and the second value represents the left and right spacing. So this is telling the margin to be an automatic amount on the left and the right of this element called wrapper that is surrounding everything else. So if I go ahead and run that, it'll center everything. So you can see there's an equal amount of margin here and an equal amount of margin there. And in fact, as the browser window shrinks and grows, that margin will adjust itself because it's set to auto. So that's the typical way that you'll see people centering content. Okay. Now in the upcoming exercise, instead of centering all of the content, we're just going to be centering certain pieces of the content. So what I went ahead and did in the exercises, you'll see, is I created a class called wrapper, and I applied it in multiple locations throughout. So for example, I could just apply it inside of this top bar here and above and inside of below. And that way you can kind of have bars that stretch across the whole screen, but then content inside of those bars that centers itself. Okay. So that's a really good way to work with layouts and to conveniently center everything, is to use something called a wrapper, or some people call it a container, and set it to have a margin of 0 auto, and that'll push the element into the middle. Okay, great. So that's really all we need to look at now. Let's go ahead and apply all of these things we've learned into the continued exercise that we've been working on for the ZHW Shoe Company. And then after you complete that exercise, then you can move on to the next code challenge.